Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions of the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses. Discovering the brilliance of Aquinas and his Catholic faith is day 285. So let's get started. We're covering today questions 55 and 56 of the supplement to the Summa, that is, of the impediment of affinity and of the impediment of spiritual relationship. The translation that I always use in these podcasts is the one generously provided to me by Ave Maria Press, the 5-volume set translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican province, which you can now get at a discounted price from Ave Maria Press's site by typing in the code SUMMA10, and so here we go. Article 1. Whether a person contracts affinity through the marriage of a blood relation. This would be if your mother passed and your father remarried. Although you wouldn't be related to your stepmother by consanguinity, you would now be related by what is called affinity. And that is because in marriage, as Jesus says, the two become one flesh. And that new union with your father to your stepmother would also bring you into a new relationship with that new spouse. You would be related to the stepparent by affinity. Article 2, whether affinity remains after the death of a husband or wife. If one's father dies, are they still related to their stepmother by affinity? St. Thomas says yes in his words. The marriage tie causes affinity not only by reason of actual union, but also by reason of the union having been effected in the past. Therefore, your stepmother would still be your stepmother even after your biological father has passed, is what St. Thomas is saying here. Article 3, whether unlawful intercourse causes affinity. As Aquinas puts it, he who is joined to a harlot is made one body. That's 1 Corinthians 6:16. Now this is the reason why marriage caused affinity. Therefore unlawful intercourse does so for the same reason. Further, carnal intercourse is the cause of affinity, as shown by the definition of affinity, which definition is as follows. Affinity is the relationship of persons which results from the carnal intercourse and is altogether void of blood relationship. But there is carnal copulation, even in unlawful intercourse. Therefore, unlawful intercourse causes affinity. Article 4, whether affinity is caused by betrothal. To quote Aquinas again, for brevity's sake, betrothal causes not affinity as marriage does, but something like affinity. This is called the justice of public honesty, which is an impediment to marriage, even as affinity and consanguinity are, and according to the same degrees, and is defined thus. The justice of public honesty is a relationship arising out of betrothal and derives its force from ecclesiastical institution by reason of its honesty. Article 5, whether affinity is a cause of affinity, and the answer to this question is in the negative. Your stepmom, keeping our hypothetical example, is related to your father by marriage, which is a true becoming one, which you, the child of your father, is therefore related to her by affinity. But this doesn't continue endlessly towards all the members of your stepmother's family. They are related by consanguinity or affinity to her, but not to you. Article 6, whether affinity is an impediment to marriage. In a word from our article, it is written in Leviticus 18:8, you shall not uncover the nakedness of thy father's wife. Now she is only related by affinity in this case. Therefore, affinity is an impediment to marriage. Article 7, whether affinity in itself admits of degrees. The degree of affinity is going to follow the relationship of consanguinity. If my father marries someone who is not my biological mother, she is a stepmom. If my sister marries a guy not related to me by blood, he is a brother-in-law. Affinity is based on and follows the relationship of consanguinity, as St. Thomas puts it here. And whatever degree of consanguinity I am related to the husband, in that same degree of affinity I am related to the wife. Article 8, whether the degrees of affinity extend in the same way as the degrees of consanguinity. In a word from St. Thomas, a woman is connected with me by affinity from the very fact that she is married to a blood relation of mine. Therefore, in whatever degree her husband is related to me by blood, she is related to me in that same degree by affinity. And so the degrees of affinity should be reckoned in the same number as the degrees of consanguinity. Article 8, whether a marriage contracted by persons with the degrees of affinity or consanguinity should always be annulled. Also given briefly in our article, since all copulation, apart from lawful marriage, is a mortal sin, which the Church uses all her endeavors to prevent, it belongs to her to separate those between whom there cannot be valid marriage, especially those related by blood or by affinity, who cannot without incest be united in the flesh. Article 9, whether it is necessary to proceed by way of accusation for the annulment of a marriage contracted by persons related to each other by affinity or consanguinity. For the sake of keeping this episode brief, and since St. Thomas's responses are in these articles brief and sufficient to continue quoting him, he writes, whatever is unlawful can be denounced, but the marriage of relatives by affinity and consanguinity is unlawful, therefore can be denounced. It is in this way that a marriage is denounced when through ignorance of an impediment it is deemed lawful, whereas it is actually unlawful. Article 11, whether in a suit of this kind one should proceed by hearing witnesses in the same way as in other suits. Aquinas responds to this article, allowing us to move on to our next question. He says here, witnesses are called in a suit in order to give the judge evidence concerning matters of doubt. Now evidence should be afforded the judge in this suit as in other suits, since he must not pronounce a hasty judgment on what is not proven. Therefore here, as in other lawsuits, witnesses should be called. We move then on to question 56 of the impediment of spiritual relationship. Article 1, whether spiritual relationship is an impediment to marriage. What we are talking about here in spiritual relationship would be something like a godparent, being a godparent to someone, or even if in an emergency you had to baptize someone yourself. The relationship between godparent and godchild, or the baptized and the baptizer, is the kind of relationship we are speaking about here. Now, I don't see this spiritual relationship as an impediment to marriage cited in canon law currently, although I could be mistaken on that, but it seems like in St. Thomas's day there were laws concerning this. So in a response to our first question here, of whether spiritual relationship is an impediment to marriage, St. Thomas responds, spiritual relationship does not hinder any of the chief marriage goods. It hinders one of the secondary goods, namely the extension of friendship, because spiritual relationship is by itself a sufficient reason for friendship. Therefore, as carnal relationship hinders marriage, even so does spiritual relationship by command of the Church. Article 2, whether spiritual relationship is contracted by baptism only. Both in baptism and confirmation, the Church asks for another person to come and thereby be united to the one in a kind of way, to the one being baptized or being confirmed. Therefore, because we have baptismal godparents, we have confirmation sponsors, it would seem spiritual relationship is contracted, not with baptism only, but also with confirmation. To quote St. Thomas, others say that spiritual relationship is contracted through two sacraments only, namely confirmation and baptism, and this is the more common opinion. Article 3, whether spiritual relationship is contracted between the person baptized and the person who raises him from the sacred font. The person who raises one from the sacred font can meant to apply to the deacon or priest who baptizes, as well as the godparent. And according to St. Thomas, these do contract a spiritual relationship, as well as the one who sponsors the candidate in the sacrament of confirmation. As he says, now while he who confirms the sacrament stands in the place of God, whose instrument and minister he is, he who raises a baptized person from the sacred font or holds the candidate for confirmation stands in the place of the Church. Therefore, spiritual relationship is contracted with both. Article 4, whether spiritual relationship passes from husband to wife. If a couple is married and the husband of that couple, for example, becomes your godparent, then you are also going to have a spiritual relationship with the wife, since that husband and wife are one flesh. However, if your godparent is not married and then later becomes married, this spiritual relationship will not pass over to them, since in raising you from the font, the future spouse was not included. Article 5, our last article, whether spiritual relationship passes to the godfather's carnal children. According to St. Thomas, this is the case, and I will quote his response, bringing our episode to a close. A son is something of his father, not conversely. Wherefore spiritual relationship passes from father to his carnal son, and not conversely. Thus it is clear that there are three spiritual relationships, one called spiritual fatherhood between godfather and godchild, another called co-paternity between the godparent and carnal parent of the same person, and the third is called spiritual brotherhood between godchild and the carnal children of the same parent. Each of these hinders the contracting of marriage and voids the contract. And with that, we come to the close of another episode. We have just finished covering questions 55 and 56 of the supplement to the Summa, that is, of the impediment of affinity and of the impediment of spiritual relationship. My name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow.